This is not my book. From the very beginning, it was about getting out of the way of these stories of people who were involved in this explosion and dug their friends out of the rubble and using their bare hands, K-bar knives, shovels, crowbar if they could find one. And then the stories of the families who were left behind and who lost loved ones that day. And you're dealing with stories of people who, it's 41 years ago now almost, but it's still recent enough where you're dealing with real people and real emotions and real feelings and real loss. And some people who are still dealing with the emotional trauma of that day, they're still living in October 23rd of 1983. And then those who have moved on, when you bring them back to that day to tell that story, you can tell just how hard it is for them to go back to that day. So you have to be extremely respectful. I wanted to be extremely thoughtful about all of this, but the voice is of those people who were there and of those people who lost loved ones.
Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post-9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 113 features Jack Carr, the author of Targeted Beirut, who he wrote with Pulitzer Prize finalist James M. Scott, based on comprehensive interviews with survivors, extensive military records, as well as personal letters, diaries, and photographs. This is the authoritative account of that deadly attack. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time.
All right. Good afternoon from the great state of Ohio and the great state of Utah. Jack Carr, welcome back to Veteran Made.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great to see you.
Yeah, man, you too. So we are here talking about Targeted Beirut, your first nonfiction work, which is really exciting. I'd love to kind of dive right in. So, I mean, this one is a little bit more dense, right, than your fiction work, but you still have been able to weave great storytelling into it, and makes it kind of feel thriller-esque as we're there with all of these real life characters. So, I'd love to start by asking what different approaches you took writing these kind of real human characters versus your fictional characters.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing was that I wanted to get out of the way of the story. This is not my book. It's not James Scott's book. It's that's my co-author who I partnered with on this, who's a historian, Pulitzer Prize finalist, amazing guy. I can talk about how we linked up for this project as well. But from the very beginning, it was about getting out of the way of these stories of people who were involved in this explosion and dug their friends out of the rubble and using their bare hands, K-bar knives, shovels, a crowbar if they could find one. And then the stories of the families who were left behind and who lost loved ones that day. And you're dealing with stories of people who, it's 41 years ago now almost, but it's still recent enough where you're dealing with real people and real emotions and real feelings and real loss. And some people who are still dealing with the emotional trauma of that day, they're still living in October 23rd of 1983. And then those who have moved on, when you bring them back to that day to tell that story, you can tell just how hard it is for them to go back to that day. So you have to be extremely respectful. I wanted to be extremely thoughtful about all of this, but the voice is of those people who were there and of those people who lost loved ones. We had 600 pages of letters from Dr. John Hudson. We had over 1,000 pages of letters in total, and we had audio tapes that he sent home to his wife and his young son. And then we had recently declassified documents from the Reagan administration, so we could paint a picture of what was happening at the executive levels back in Washington, D.C. that led to the decisions to put Marines ashore in Beirut, Lebanon. So the different approach was that this is someone else's voice. And it's the voice of those people who are telling the story. So that was a different approach. But for me, I wanted to make sure from the get-go, when I talked to Simon & Schuster, I didn't want this to be like pop history, meaning that I wasn't just going to read a bunch of books on that part of the world and the very few that are written on Beirut, Lebanon in this time frame, and then kind of regurgitate them and maybe add some of my own analysis and then throw it out there as a nonfiction. I did not want to do that. I wanted to make this be an actual work of history. And when I approached Simon & Schuster, I did it because I always knew I would go into the nonfiction space at some point. As you know, I weave a lot of history into the pages of my thrillers. I talk about historical events on my social channels. I'm a student of warfare, a student of history, very natural for me to do that. And so it is a natural progression to add this to the offering, to do something in the nonfiction space. And I waited till I thought I'd built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster to be able to pitch this. And so it was about 3 years ago now, and I pitched them the idea and told them I wanted to explore different terrorist events and capture the strategic, operational, and tactical level lessons and humanize these events and do it in a way that was thoughtful and respectful, not sensational, and do something really that would have a lasting impact that people can go to if they want to learn about Beirut 1983. Well, now there's a book about it. There really wasn't that seminal work yet out there. There wasn't that documentary. There wasn't that movie that you could point to if you'd asked me what you should read on it. And now there is. So I pitched Simon & Schuster on it, and I said, hey, but I want to work with with someone who really knows what they're doing in the nonfiction spaase. And there's only one person I want to work with, James Scott. He has 5 books out, 4 on World War II. The other one's on the USS Liberty. And I just loved his work. And they've connected us, and we hit it off. And now we're dear friends, and we're already at work on the next one. But also, in my original pitch to Simon & Schuster, I said I want one a year. And so my thrillers will come out in the spring and the nonfiction will come out in the fall. And then about 2 weeks into the research, I called them back and said, hey, I know what I said. I know what the contract says, but this is going to be at least a 2-year process for each book. In order to really do these events justice, it's going to take 2 years at the minimum. And it might take more. I never let a deadline, dictate anything. The work has to be the best that it can possibly be. So that was kind of the background on how I got here. And I just kept coming back to Beirut 1983 out of all the different terrorist events that I could dive into. And I wrote down about 3 pages from the end of World War II up until present day. And I kept coming back to Beirut 1983 because it was such a turning point in our relationship with the Middle East. And the shadow of the event still looms large over U.S. foreign policy, but also from the enemy's perspective, from Iran's perspective, it really set the model that they've been using up to and through today, the use of proxy forces in particular. So they set the rules with this, and the way that the United States responded also taught them that terrorism via proxy forces works. And they're not the only terrorist organization to learn that from this event. So it was an important event. It wasn't talked about enough. There isn't that seminal work yet. And the Marine Corps really wanted to move on from this event. This is not a glorious day in Marine Corps history. It's not raising the flag on Iwo Jima. And now that I've been able to talk to these guys who were there, they had that sense right away as well, that the Marine Corps wanted to move on from this. So they felt, and speaking generally, that they were left behind. And they were so grateful that someone was going to tell their story in a thoughtful, respectful way. And for me, I was just so thankful that they trusted me with this story. So it was humbling. It's hard to even talk about because it's so emotional getting to talk to these guys and then putting their stories in the book.
Yeah, I mean, to go there a little bit, right, with the real people and the real families and the real platoon mates, right, like that I've been able to experience that in person. I was with you in Virginia at the Virginia War Memorial a couple of years ago. And then on the Red Sky Morning tour, we popped over to Indianapolis. And in both of those audiences, we had retired Marines who stood up and asked you a question about how you were approaching it, because they had platoon mates that that were killed in the bombing. So what has it been like for you to field some of those questions on tour and as you're speaking, but also as you're interviewing these folks? Like, what does what kind of weight, did that place onto your shoulders, and how did it affect your storytelling, if at all?
Yeah, I didn't think of it as a heavy weight. I thought of it more as an honor.
Mm.
And but like in the thrillers, if I mess something up or I get something wrong, I can just say, "Oh, it's fiction." You know. In this, you don't have that luxury, nor would you ever want to. You have to get it right. So I didn't really feel a weight of this until you just mentioned it. But
Sorry.
but, now, but now I see, I see it, but I didn't look at it that way from the outset. It was more like an honor to tell these stories and extremely humbling to do so. So I looked at it like that. And I looked at it like, hey, this is a responsibility, and I need to make sure that I get this right, and that when these guys read the book, they know it's an honest take on what happened. Not even a take; it's the story of what happened, and
Yeah.
and it was done in a thoughtful, respectful way out of the respect for them and the guys that didn't make it home.
Absolutely. From a craft perspective, what was it like to collaborate with a nonfiction author? I mean, you've already done this, right? Where you've collaborated with screenwriters in a writer's room and EPing on the film side of things, which you didn't previously have experience with. And then now you're doing the same thing, working with another nonfiction author and obviously a storied historian. From a craft perspective, how did you two collaborate? What was difficult? How did you align on an approach?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that and that you mentioned the screenwriting side of it, because that does play in. Meaning, on the thriller side, that's all me. If it's horrible, there's no one to blame but myself. That is all on me. Hollywood, my experience there is still very limited, but it's a few years old now, and now two shows and starting a third. Very collaborative. Even if there's one name on the script or that episode, that is a very collaborative process that led to that final script. For this next one here, for Dark Wolf, I'm writing the finale with the showrunner David DiGilio. Our names are on it, but it is extremely collaborative. Not just other writers in the writers' room, because most of them move on to their projects when that side is done, and it falls back to the executive production team. So to me, to David DiGilio, to Max Adams, to Jared Shaw, to Chris Pratt, to Taylor Kitsch, to Fred Toye, one of the directors, and so it falls, Antoine Fuqua. So it falls to all of us to then continue to develop those after those writers have moved on. So extremely collaborative is my point, as you mentioned. So this was also collaborative, but not to that extent. So this is just the two of us, not to the extent where you have executive production teams and it goes up for notes and then comes back down and all the rest of it. Yeah. So it's collaborative in a sense, but not like that. So it's a mix. It's in between, but more on the side of more individual. Because now, if no one likes this book or if we mess it up, well, there's just two people to blame, not Amazon or like all the people involved in that thing. Like, I knew we shouldn't have done that type of a thing. So it does fall back on both of us. But I went in as a student. I typically do that with anything. Like in the Philippines, I was there in 2009. I was supposed to be the advisor to a Philippine Marine general in the Southern Island chain. This general has been fighting an insurgency in the Southern Island chain for like 30 years. And so any advice I can give him are really going to come in the form of some sort of like technical surveillance type stuff that the United States may have that can help them in whatever they're doing. So I approached that from the student perspective, and I learned a ton from him. It was amazing. And he became like a mentor down there, where I learned so much about counterinsurgency and insurgency, specifically to that island chain, but also more broadly. So I approached this in the same way, which was a similar way that I went into the screenwriting, which is as a student, and also knowing that what I wrote in the thriller is going to change because this is now a different medium, and I'm trusting these people to do the best job with it that they can. But now I'm a part of it too, so I need to add value to this, knowing that my job here isn't just to try to keep things exactly as they were in the novel, but to add value to this show in whatever way I possibly can. So I approach this the same way. I am a student in the nonfiction space. I'm obviously a reader and a consumer of it and a student of history, but I am not a historian, nor am I a scholar who knows what they're doing when it comes to research and knows the proper way to annotate things and the legal way to annotate all of these things in the notes section. Although the notes section is pretty robust in here. And even the photographs. There were some photographs I wanted to use that we couldn't use because the company that owned it wasn't Getty or AP. Anyway, it was one of these ones that you would know if I said the name, but it had changed hands so many times since 1983. They couldn't even tell us who owned the rights to these photos. And the Marine Corps just writes on like originally AP, and they don't care because it's the Marine Corps. But for us and Simon & Schuster and the legal team there, no, it has to be done right. You have to have permission and have paid for every single photograph, and they're licensed or however that works. And there were some we just couldn't figure out, even though it was with a big name company, just because things had changed hands so often. So all of those little things are very different from the thriller space, from the fiction side of things. So I went in as a student. And I'm with essentially one of the best in the business, James Scott, who's also a phenomenal human being and a nice person, which I think also helped when it comes to doing these interviews and establishing trust, because you have my background, military, which helps establish trust with that person who's going to start talking to you. But then the way that James can ask these questions and you get a sense that he's just a good guy right off the bat. He's not coming in just like, okay, boom, boom, boom. He is coming in and naturally develops a relationship because he's a nice, genuinely nice person. So with the both of us together, the veterans of Beirut felt very comfortable talking to us. And a lot of them said that and let us know that they haven't talked about this, haven't wanted to talk about this ever, but because of this team, they feel comfortable doing it. So for me, I came in it from that. I learned a ton about research and going into archives and who to contact and how to do all that sort of thing, how to go through these letters and photographs and tapes and then declassified documents, Reagan's diary, to get a sense of how he viewed what was going on. So so I had a long way of saying that I approached it from the perspective of a student.
So did you two conduct all of the interviews together?
No. James conducted the lion's share of the interviews in person, not all in person, but most in person. And then he has a system where he can either have a researcher go into different archives if he can't be there, or go personally, which he did for most all of them. And then I got to interview different people where it made sense for me to be there, where it worked out. It was mostly a scheduling thing.
Right.
Like I would have been at every single one if I didn't have another book to write, didn't have a show to write, didn't have, all those things. So it was more of scheduling than anything else, because I would have loved to have been at every single one and taken the notes on every single one. But fortunately, I got to meet most everybody that we write about in the book.
Yeah. And then from a writing perspective, how did you two kind of consolidate who was responsible for what, right? Because I can hear your voice as a writer through a lot of the storytelling, and you're obviously speaking about James from a research standpoint. From a writing standpoint, how did the share of responsibility break down between the two of you, and how did you work together?
Yeah, very naturally, in that when we started out, I already knew the topic. So he had to be interested in that topic to want to do it. And I happened to connect with him at a time where he'd done 4 books on World War II. Like I said, one on the USS Liberty. He was in the middle of another one on World War II that he actually put on pause for this. And his editor and publisher said, yeah, put this one on pause, do this one and then come back to this World War II one. But he'd done so much World War II that I just happened to hit him at a stage when he was already thinking about what to do next and moving on from World War II, having been immersed in that for so long. So I hit him at a good time. And he happened to also be going to an event where he was going to be talking with the head of Marine Corps Archives, and got to ask them, hey, what do you guys have on this event? And found out that there was a lot. So I had the topic, I had the title, obviously, had an outline of the way I thought we should break it down, how I wanted to end it, which I typically do for the thrillers as well. So it was natural to do for this. And then we just started talking about how we're going to break that outline down even further and how it makes sense as a story. So then we started working on it together from there. So very collaborative process, but oh my gosh, research wise and everything else, that's 100% James, and that is me as a student. Just like with the first episode of The Terminal List, where I'm a student essentially, and I'm so lucky that the showrunner David DiGilio wanted to bring me in. Well, Antoine and Chris wanted to bring me in as well, but to have that team that wanted me involved, where I could be a student and add value at the same time. So it was really similar in this case as well.
I love it. The thing that had me the most excited about when I found out that you were writing this book, and then when I found out that it was a series, the thing that had me the most excited about it was the opportunity to deeply study some of these things that we are now encountering in culture, right? Where we are now, people are coming to grips with what our foreign policy has been like and why it has been that way for the last 20 plus years, right? Like you're bringing this in, we all assume the global war on terror started on September 12th, 2001, but in reality, it started 20 years previously through this and through a lot of the things that you're writing about here. And we're dealing with a mainstream media climate right now where people are starting to see things a little bit more clearly because they're doing a lot of their own research. We're seeing, people go viral for alternate takes on World War II history and some of these other things. So in terms of the readers being an informed citizenry, do you think about that as you're writing this book and thinking about the series, ways that you can arm, might be the wrong word, but that you can help the citizenry become a little bit more informed about what has happened and what, not just what we can do to prevent it, but how we can engage with it along the way, right? I mean, we're all sitting around the dinner table having these political conversations, especially right now. And every election cycle, you talk all the time about how, the most of us think in terms of 4-year cycles here. The wisest among us think in terms of 8-year cycles, but a lot of our adversaries globally are thinking in terms of centuries and even longer. Very long-winded way of asking, what is your approach with this book and the series to get the citizenry a little bit more informed?
Yeah, so I didn't think about that like at the tactical level of building this out. This is telling
Sure.
this particular story, but strategically, certainly at the beginning and overarching plan for the books, that is certainly a major factor. Capturing these events, so that at least the least that I can do as an author and as a student of warfare and a student of history is to capture these events. Whether anybody reads them or not, that's a different story. But at least I can capture them. And we're not very good in this country at taking lessons of the past and applying them going forward as wisdom. But at the very least, here's the book on Beirut, 1983. Here are the lessons in here, and it's humanized so that, and you're at these executive levels, let's say they're military executive levels, senior level officers, or elected representatives, specifically in the executive branch, that those decisions that you make, let's say in the Oval Office, well, that decision filters its way all the way down this chain of command, and it ends up with the final decision maker. And that final decision maker on a chain that starts with the president, it goes down and it eventually ends up with an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid with a rifle, off safe, finger on a trigger, standing at some sort of a checkpoint somewhere around the world with a vehicle approaching, dust coming up behind it, and it looks like it's sagging a little bit. So maybe it's laden with explosives or it has horrible suspension. And you are the final decision maker in a chain that started with the president of the United States. And so part of humanizing this is also hopefully making people aware who may end up in that office or may end up at senior level military leadership levels, that the impact of their decisions that are being made thousands of miles from the battlefield in air-conditioned offices in and around the DC area, they're going to have a real world impact, not just on that kid who's standing that watch in wherever he has been sent, but on that family as well. Even if that person isn't killed, he may come home with dealing with the emotional or physical trauma of the battlefield, or he doesn't come home at all, or she these days doesn't come home at all. That's multi-generational impact that those decisions up in these air-conditioned offices are having. So the least that someone can do up there, and their responsibility, in fact, is to understand the nature of the conflict in which we're engaged or about to commit U.S. forces. That is what you owe all of those families that are going to be impacted multi-generationally from this final decision maker who's out there on the front line. So you have to put in the requisite time, energy, and effort into studying the enemy, studying that part of the world, and thinking long and hard before you commit U.S. forces overseas.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. Even today, I served in the Air Force for 4 years. I had a couple of family members, generations above me or below me, I don't know how to say that the right way, grandfathers and uncles and things, who served. So we come from a military family, not like an established military family, but we have that understanding right within our family. But then you read the stats about how, I think it's like 90% of Americans don't know anyone who served in the military. So humanizing stories like this and bringing people into that kind of generational contact that you're describing, I think is really helpful, not just for our senior leaders and elected representatives, but also just for the populace at large.
Yeah, no, it's that's a part of it. That's a part of it. And like I said, it's the least that I can do. So so this one made the most sense to start with. There was really no question. You could have started maybe with the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, but there really wasn't that model yet for what was to come. It was more murky. It wasn't the rules weren't yet in place, and those rules were set by Iran and a direct result of what happened on October 23rd, 1983. So that was the reason for that. And I distinctly remember this as a kid. I remember I was already on my path into the military, even at that young age. I was reading anything I could possibly find. Anytime there was a newspaper or a magazine that came across our family's kitchen table that had anything to do with the military on it, I was in there, even at that very young age. And I distinctly remember the time of the Newsweek. We had both those that came to our house, and they had the same picture from this event on their covers the week that this happened. So I remember it as a kid, and obviously it has been it still looms large over our country's foreign policy today.
Yeah. I know you said you've adjusted the cadence of output for this series, but how are you juggling all these different things? You've got screen, you've got print for fiction, print for nonfiction. You're working on a lot of things. Have you adjusted your approach in terms of workload and output and input and all that stuff?
I am working on it. I always say this every year, but this is my year to really figure it out, or at least take a concrete step in the direction of getting more organized and efficient. Up to last September, it was just me juggling all of it. And it was like, so that was about 6 years into things. So now we're, I think, 7 years into things. And you're essentially, as a startup, you are the CEO, the CFO, the CMO, social media manager. You're making the product. You're doing all of that. Coming up with strategy, business strategy, even with no background in that. So you're doing all of it. So last September, I hired a chief of staff, and so she's amazing, and she's on board now. And then we slowly started hiring some people over the last year to fill some gaps. So maybe I don't have to spend time, editing the newsletter so much, or show notes for the podcast, or all of those things that maybe somebody else can do, so that I can concentrate just on writing. And maybe I'm not writing from 10 at night until 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the morning as I get closer to deadline, so I can be a little healthier. So that's a very long way of me saying that I'm exhausted, but I am taking concrete steps this year to fill some of those gaps and bring in people who can maybe do things better than I can on some of those verticals, but they give me time to write, because that is the thing that only I do. So if someone can do e-commerce a little better, well, guess what? Let's have them write the copy for the hat that's online. I don't maybe need to do that. Maybe I could just review it or something like that. So it's up to now, it's all been me. So it's but now that's time to start changing that, because there are so many projects on the currently that I'm working on and on the horizon as well.
Are those easy adjustments? You don't strike me as somebody who that it would be difficult for. Is it easy or getting easier for you to let go of some of those things?
No, it's not easy. And is it getting easier? I'm not sure. I'm in that transitional phase on some of them right now, so not quite yet. It's not easy yet, but hopefully over the next few months, maybe a year, you build up enough trust with the rest of the team, and they get to know how you do things, so that there's less to correct, type of a thing. So working on all that stuff right now. So essentially, it's building out a team from scratch and trying to bring people on that are fun to work with, excited, and do those parts better than I can, so that I can have time to write.
Yeah, no doubt. We've got a couple of minutes left. I've already asked you the open-ended questions that I ask at the end of each episode twice now since you've been on. So I don't want to do that again. I'm going to adjust it slightly and just ask, what are you hoping the reader gets out of this? What are you trying to implant into their hearts and into their minds as they read this story and this series as it continues?
I think it's mostly that human component, that human element, because you hear 241 people dead. It's a number, and it's a large number, but it's not really humanized unless you knew one of them or your next door neighbor or one of those types of things. So I hope it's the humanization of really who pays the price for decisions made in Washington, D.C., and who is responsible for the people that are, for the most part, in those positions. Well, the elected representatives obviously you're responsible because you vote. I'm responsible because I vote. We as a citizenry are responsible because we vote. So putting people in these places that are going to recognize that there's a human cost to all of these decisions that are made at these levels, and so there needs to be a lot of thought put in to where you commit U.S. forces. So I think that would be one of the main takeaways, is just humanizing these different events while at the same time capturing those lessons. And now it's out there.
Awesome. Well said. We'll link out, we'll tag, we'll tweet, we'll do all of those good things. David's got me the link to send out in the show notes for people to purchase. This should be live, I think, a couple of days before release. So we'll get that link out there and share it far and wide. Jack, appreciate your time. Always appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Hey, thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see you again soon.
Yes, sir.